Hello, everyone. How are you today? I am Elizabeth Corey, and I am the founder of beatingtrauma.com, and I'm here today to talk to you about trauma, and particularly trauma responses we have in our system, and how we can work with those specifically. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about positivity. And if you've known me a while or been listening to me a while, you know that this probably isn't going to be the normal conversation about positivity because honestly, I find it to be very disruptive to the healing process. Not entirely. Like, there are aspects of it that are lovely. Sometimes it is great to embody a positive understanding of things around you. Okay, so I'm not saying you have to spend your life in misery and negativity in order to heal. No, I'm not saying that. But I think we've all heard of the phrase toxic positivity, and to be fair, a lot of us think that we understand what it means to be toxically positive. But I think in reality, we understand toxic positivity as a caricature of what's really going on. Like it's the, positive talking, like guy on the stage screaming at you to just figure out. Right, yeah, okay, that is toxic positivity. But that's sort of the extreme, like that's that caricature that I'm talking about. Oftentimes when we're doing it to ourselves, it's a lot more subtle and a lot harder to spot, which, if I'm being honest, is true with a lot of the ways that we defend against our negative emotions. It's not just this, and I know people are already going to tell me they're not negative. I like to use that word because I think everybody knows what I mean when I use it. You can say traumatic emotions, that works too. But I want to be clear that I am probably one of the most embracing on all of the internet when it comes to those emotions. So I in no way mean it as a bad thing. I'm just saying that's sort of what they are. They don't feel great, right? They don't feel good to us. So most of us are just not aware of the ways we're using toxic positivity every day on an internal level to stop us from hitting those really deep traumatic emotions in our system. And this is true even if we have been really good at embracing traumatic emotions in the past, right? The controller is really sneaky. And I'll be honest, most toxic positivity on any level that it may have is going to come from that controller. The controller is the one who sort of owns those messages in general. And as you may be aware, the controller is very, very sneaky. They will do everything from pretending to be your grounded adult self to acting like the most spiritually enlightened guru that ever did walk the face of the earth. And it can be very confusing because they will also switch masks. When we start to catch on to one mask, they'll just move on to a different mask. And it can really make things quite confusing for us. But today we're going to talk about that positivity mask because it's so important for us to understand. I hear from people all the time who tell me that they would rather just focus on the positive. And you know what? I get it. I would rather just focus on the positive too, right? They tell me that the best way to deal with their pain is to tell themselves a story in their minds about how much things have changed. And these messages are very much applauded by society. Society loves this kind of approach. I mean, it's been written in book after book after book after book. And there's a whole lot of gurus and experts out there who will kind of talk about this concept. And the other thing that's confusing is that the news story isn't wrong. It's not. When we tell ourselves a positive story in response to our emotional pain, that news story isn't necessarily wrong because a lot of times it's about how things have changed. So we're not necessarily saying the old story is wrong. We're just saying, well, we don't need to feel that way anymore because it is so much better now. Or we don't need to feel that way anymore because we have addressed what really happened and we understand it differently now. So it does need to be acknowledged. And this is where I go back to this idea that I'm not just about sitting in our traumatic pain all the time. We do need to bring these new perspectives to the adult self. And that is a part of this journey too. Okay. The problem with this approach okay, is that oftentimes we aren't just telling ourselves that and continuing to process those traumatic emotions. Instead, we are replacing the past unresolved emotions with this story. This is when it becomes a problem because it doesn't resolve the traumatic emotions. It doesn't heal them. It doesn't release them. It covers those emotions up, okay? And that's a problem. So that's what I want to talk about today. It's not that telling ourselves a different story in the mind is a problem. It's that when we tell ourselves a different story in the mind to avoid the emotions that are living in the body, that is when we generally have a problem, right? That's when we are not really connecting and resolving those emotions. So I'm going to talk about this kind of from 3 different angles to give you a sense of why this is bad. Because honestly, when our controllers are doing this kind of thing, they're very, very convincing that this is the right way to do it. Okay. And it can become a really important part of our journey, and we can get stuck. We can get stuck in this place. We can be very easily convinced that what the controller is saying is right. When we are replacing our traumatic emotions with a positive story, we are invalidating ourselves and even in some cases manipulating ourselves. Okay, so we are telling ourselves that those traumatic emotions don't matter. And we may even be saying things to ourselves like, the past is in the past. None of that's important anymore. We just need to move on. Now, those are very well recognizable toxic positivity statements. However, we may not always even catch ourselves doing that. It may be so unconscious to our minds in general that we don't even know we're doing it. We may even be manipulating parts into believing that their emotions are in fact wrong, right? And honestly, we will never heal or release an emotion if we are telling ourselves that that emotion is wrong and that it's not supposed to be there. Okay. This adds to the overall confusion in our system, and it actually can increase the inner parts battles that are happening within us. And when those battles increase, when the screaming between the inner parts that builds our anxiety up and can create some pretty uncomfortable body responses as well. So telling ourselves that the traumatic emotions are wrong because maybe they don't exactly match up to the positive story about our current life, okay? Which, again, could be totally true. May not be, but it could be totally true. When we do that, we are creating significant problems in our inner psyche. There's a lot of dissonance that will build up when we do that, right? So that's the first example of why these sort of toxic positivity stories are not helpful for us when we approach it like this. Okay. So the next one is that when we are telling ourselves a positive story, it's sort of putting that on top of those traumatic emotions, we are avoiding the lessons that the emotions are trying to give us. I have heard from countless people that say, what's the point in feeling all these emotions? What is that going to fix? And what I've learned over the years is that feeling those emotions fixes everything. We are supposed to be doing far less with the mind than we think we're supposed to be doing. The mind is actually being overused in general by humanity. That may not sound very surprising to you. Most of our guidance is supposed to be coming from the body. It's supposed to be coming from that gut, from that intuition, from that grounded adult self, which is all in the body. Right? The problem is we get stuck up in the mind with these stories that we're telling ourselves, and we don't give ourselves a chance to sit with the emotions. As we sit with the emotions, which yes, sometimes we will just block emotion because of the emotion, but some of the parts that are doing the blocking know that there's a lot more to those emotions than just the emotions. The emotions actually have memories and they have lessons that they're trying to share with us. Emotions are highly evidence-based. Now, it doesn't mean that's evidence about today. Can be, but a lot of times it's evidence-based because of what has happened to us. And when we don't process those emotions, they continue to create patterns in our lives because the beliefs are still in place and the memories are not fully resolved in the conscious mind. They're sitting in the unconscious, which is generally where we convince ourselves of certain beliefs that actually are not true. One of the biggest ones that I see like this is around this idea of self-blame. So I hear from a lot of people that say, look, I know that I'm not to blame. Okay, so I'm going to actually use this as an example all the way through this process I'm talking about right now. So when shame comes up, we can sort of push it away, but just going, but I know I'm not to blame. I know I'm not to blame. Of course I'm not to blame for any of that. That's all the abuser's fault. And we may tell ourselves that in the mind and be very clear about it. And we may really, truly understand it on a really deep cognitive level. I am not to blame. Okay, I did not do those things to myself. That is the abusers. Okay, so this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about today. So when the shame comes up and says in the background at a whisper, I must have done something wrong. I must have. There's no way this could have happened to me if I didn't do anything wrong. We might hear it, barely, and then we might go, I'm not to blame. I'm not to blame. It's ridiculous. Of course I'm not. It's not my fault, right? Okay, so we may say that. But what's happening is that emotion is still sitting under there. It didn't go anywhere when you drowned it out. I promise it's still there. It's just a little harder to hear for now. But what the emotion wants to share with you, the shame wants to share with you, is all the times they were told they were to blame. All the times that maybe even abusers tried to prove it to them. Okay? And the belief systems that go with that. All these belief systems are sitting in the unconscious right now, but they're there. They're there. And so what happens is because we are putting that sort of message, I know I'm not to blame, over top of the shame that's trying to share with us, we aren't able to break the patterns that the shame is creating so that we'll resolve it because we are constantly just going, nope, 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 right? Instead, we need to sit with that shame because the shame is telling us things. It's giving us evidence. It's saying why the beliefs are there in the first place. When we hear the evidence from the shame, we can then break those patterns and change those beliefs on a far deeper level than just what's going on here in the cognitive mind. Okay? Mind, I know this is going to go against what a lot of law of attraction stuff says, but the cognitive mind has very, very little manifestation power when the unconscious mind is resisting it, because the unconscious mind has huge manifestation power. Big. That's why they often say if something is left in the shadows, it is extremely powerful. Yeah, that's what they mean. Yeah, there's some real strength to that stuff. So this is an example. And again, like I mentioned earlier, when you hear that example, you're like, that doesn't sound like toxic positivity, right? And maybe it wouldn't be considered that, like from a label perspective. So what we could say is we're telling ourselves the positive story. Right? And it's true, right? This goes back to that point I made about it being true. We're not to blame. We're not telling ourselves lies. I mean, that does sometimes happen with this kind of thing, but in this case, there's not a single lie in that. That's not the issue. The issue is we are blocking and covering up parts that don't agree with us. Yes, maybe they're wrong now. And even in the past, they were wrong, but it's based on what they were told over and over and over again. So it's not their fault. It's easy to scapegoat these parts and just be like, oh my gosh, these parts are so dumb and stupid and I don't want to hear it. But it's not going to make it go anywhere. It's just going to sit there under the surface and make us miserable, but we'll pretend we're not, which honestly is how most of human existence is happening today. So if we want to go deeper and we want to release ourselves from these unconscious emotions, messages, belief systems, memories, evidence, right? We got to stop telling ourselves that the way we feel in our unconscious is wrong and unacceptable. Yeah, are we saying it quite that way? Probably not, but we're saying it. And this gets into the last way I wanted to talk about this today, which is that this kind of positivity is re-traumatizing. Using logic to tell yourself that your emotions are wrong is re-traumatizing, okay? And there's a reason for that, right? When we do this, we are treating ourselves just like the abusers. And I see this all the time in sort of less traumatizing ways too, but the truth is, that abusers often told us that our emotions are overblown or that we're too sensitive or that our experiences were not that bad. So they replace our emotional response to the true experiences we've had with a story that is different. Oftentimes is not true, right? It's a lie. It's like, things aren't that bad. Everything's fine. What's your problem? Everything's just dandy, right? So when we say to our parts, things aren't that bad, even if we're right now, like things might not be that bad, we're still doing exactly what the abusers did to our parts. We are re-traumatizing ourselves because we are maintaining and continuing the exact pattern that we experienced as a child that was so invalidating and so frustrating and confusing back then, to the point that we decided to dissociate because we didn't know how else to resolve what was going on, Because we'd say, hey, bad thing happening. I feel bad. And person goes, nothing bad is happening. I don't know why you feel bad. That's weird. And then we turn around as adults and do the same thing to ourselves, right? So this is re-traumatizing, right? We learned in childhood, okay, the parts, by the way, that are doing this to our own, like, unconscious parts, learned how to do this in childhood. So they're taking a page out of the playbook of the very abusers that traumatized us, and they are doing it again. We end up saying very, very similar things to ourselves to block those traumatic emotions now. And unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, that does not end our patterns. That keeps our patterns very much in place. And it oftentimes keeps us looking externally for someone who can validate us, but because we're not validating ourselves, we're not going to find it. I mean, usually we're not going to find it, right? Sometimes we get lucky and find it anyway. Like I've had, for example, clients who came to me and said, I don't believe myself. And I have said to that client, well, I believe you, right? And so it can happen. It does happen, sometimes with professionals or whatnot, it can happen, right? That kind of thing. But it's very rare. And looking for it out there in the world, we are usually going to find stuff that kind of matches our own place, wherever we are in our journey, right? So if we're not believing ourselves, we will often meet people who mirror back to us similar controller statements that we are telling ourselves. Lisa is asking, so what we need to do is validate our emotions and then change the narrative. Yes. And here's the great thing. When we validate our emotions, we actually don't even need to try to change the narrative. Like, we don't need to use the mind to change the narrative. When we validate our emotions and heal them, the narrative just sort of changes. It's actually, I'd say it's magical, but I know it's not magical because it takes a heck of a lot of work to sit with our emotions. That is hard. But as we do it, those old beliefs in the unconscious start to sort of release themselves. And because we brought whatever information forward with those emotions, we look like our mind, the adult self, like frontal lobe, starts to shift, and it looks at the scenario differently, and the narrative shifts, and it shifts on that really deep level because that's where the emotions have been living. And as it does, patterns change. And it's not always magical. Sometimes we have to do some really hard things to bring in the new pattern for good. A lot of times it has to do, unfortunately, with setting boundaries, right? It's like, that is hard work, especially when we've never been allowed to do it. But there are sometimes I will sit with my pain not knowing at all what I'm going to do about what's in front of me. And as I sit with the pain, solutions start to come forward because a new narrative is playing out for me. And I can see things in such a different light. And this is the beauty of emotional processing that I just cannot possibly promote this enough in this world today, because it is something that's so dramatically missing from most of our daily lives. We're not processing how we feel, right? We're really, really good at using the mind. We're not processing how we feel. And it is the feeling that changes everything, right? I'm here to tell you that is 100% the truth. So the next time you hear yourself going, well, it doesn't make sense that I would feel that way because blah, 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 whatever the story is in your head, step back and go, okay, but I feel that way. Just kind of work to let the feeling be what it is This is going to step you out of that controller, which is where most of us spend a lot of our days. It's going to step you out of that controller and into that grounded adult self who can, in fact, hold space for the parts who are having the feeling and sit with it. Now, for those of you who have been around a while and followed me for a while, you know that I encourage people to journal from those emotions. And I think it's an excellent way to kind of validate and let the emotion be there. The emotion is, again, not going to give you the positive story. It's going to tell you the really hard to hear stuff, the stuff that you don't want to be there, that you haven't wanted to be there for many, many years. But as you write from it, again, narrative starts to change, beliefs start to shift. And that means that patterns start to break and manifestations start to change, right? Like all that stuff changes when we hear from the emotion that holds those old beliefs. So this is how we do it. So, and if you're looking to explore further how to catch yourself at this, because it can be hard to catch yourself at this, I'll be honest, especially when society just kind of promotes it all the time, please do reach out to me. I have a 5-week program that really introduces people to this process and helps them determine if it's something that can really benefit them. I feel like it benefits a whole lot of people. But feel free to reach out if you have an interest maybe in checking it out and seeing what it could possibly offer you, because emotional processing is the key to a better life. And I know because I've seen it in my own life and the lives of my clients as well. So thank you all so much for being here today. I hope you found this helpful. I look forward to talking to you guys again next Tuesday, same time, same place, and have a great week. I will talk to you all soon. Bye.